Hello everybody, this is John Mark Johnson Jr., host of Reformed GGA, and I apologize for the sound of the air conditioning unit in the background, but the temperature has changed. Baby, it's hot outside, and the air conditioning is my saving grace right now. So it is running in the background, and also for those of you who are not familiar with the channel, fair warning, my videos are usually on the long side. They do not usually have, great graphics or shooting footage of any kind. Live shooting does not happen in the videos at all. And then on top of that, I've been told that I'm picky and weird and I care about things that I probably really shouldn't care about, but I'm me, so here we go. The topic of the day, the great PC3 battle. And by PC3, I mean a pistol caliber gun with a third point of contact. So that includes pistol caliber carbines, that includes pistol caliber guns with a brace on them, things like that. PC3, pistol caliber gun with a third point of contact. And we're going to be talking about some of the PC3s that I either have owned, do own, or interact with on a fairly regular basis. So we're going to be taking a look at a couple of CZ Scorpions, the Sub 2000 from Kel-Tec, the Stribog Sp9a1 from Grand Power. I have not gotten my hands on the other version of the Streebog yet, but hopefully in the not too distant future things will be possible. And then also the AKV, which I do currently own and possess. And the question that I'm going to be looking at is, which pistol caliber gun have I personally had the best experience with? Okay, so this is my personal opinion. Please do not take what I say as being absolutely definitive. It is not meant that way. I am describing these things from my particular point of view, in the hopes that some of those particular point of views and those particular preferences may apply to some of you out there. I am in no way assuming that every single thing that applies to me is going to apply to everyone else, or that my experiences will be everybody else's experiences. I'm not assuming that, but I'm putting out the information so that people can at least examine it and get an idea of how these things work from someone who has actually worked with these guns on a fairly frequent basis. Alright, so that said, what are we going to be looking at? We're going to be looking at quite a few things. We're going to be looking at, say, the initial cost of the guns. And when I'm talking about the initial cost, I'm talking about getting the gun itself, a brace or stock as may apply, and a red dot. To me, that is what is necessary to have a functional recreational PC3. That is, to me, what makes for a functional PC3, not necessarily an optimal PC3, or a PC3 that has been set up for self-defense or home defense, or a PC3 that has been set up for competition or something like that. I'm not talking about competition. I'm not talking necessarily about self-defense. I'm talking about basic recreational usage. You need the gun, you need the brace or stock. For it to be a PC3, it has to have a third point of contact. That's in the definition. And then functionally, these days, most people put an optic of some kind on the gun, and for a gun that's meant for short range, like a PC3 would be, red dots are just typically the way that people go, so that's what I'm including. Alright, and also I'm not including a bunch of magazines, which are good to have, but different people have different preferences on how many magazines you need. Some people are like, well, if it comes with one in the box, then one is all I need. That's one end of the spectrum, and then the other end of the spectrum is like, well, they were on sale, so I got 20 of them. There's everything in between as well. I'm not going to figure that into it because that really varies depending on the purpose and also the application. If this is something that you're using in competition, yeah, more magazines are definitely going to be more common. If this is something that you're using for defense, more magazines is often more common. If this is just a plinker that you take out once in a while just to go and have some fun, you might get by with just one or two magazines. It just depends on the application. Right, and then we're also going to talk about the functional weight unloaded, and this is because all of the guns that we're talking about have different size magazines that apply to them. and those magazines can also be loaded differently. We're talking about all 9mm guns here, but 9mm ammunition does not all weigh the same. If you have a 115 grain bullet versus say 165 grain bullets, and then you differentiate that for a 10-round magazine or a 20-round magazine or a 30-round magazine or even a 35 or a 50-round magazine, the amount of weight that you're attaching to the gun via the magazine can vary quite considerably and not overly useful to talk about. So we're just going to leave that off and say, you know, decide what magazine size, what kind of bullet weights you want to add. That's up to you. We're just talking about the functional weight unloaded, given that we have the gun, brace, and stock, brace or stock depending on the type of gun that we're talking about, and a red dot. That's all that we're worried about as far as functional weights. We're not going to include the magazine or the ammunition. Those are obviously going to have weight, but it varies quite a bit. We're also going to talk about trigger pull. There's lots of things with trigger pull that you could rate. What I've decided to go with is primarily the trigger weight. But that doesn't mean that we're not going to talk about the other aspects of the pull as well, like how long or how short it is, how stagey it is, how clean and crisp it is, does it have a well-defined breakpoint, etc. We're going to talk about those things, but we're primarily going to focus on pull weight. We're also going to talk about field strip and cleaning. Much more emphasis on field stripping it than on cleaning it. All of these guns that we're talking about are blowback 9mm guns, and they're all dirty. They all shoot dirty. That's just blowback guns in general. Blowback guns, not blowback 9mm guns, they're all going to be fairly dirty, and because of that, it's kind of a pain to clean, just no matter which one you're talking about. But if the gun is easier to field strip, that definitely can help. And so more of the emphasis is going to be there. We're also going to talk about the ergonomics, and by ergonomics, I'm specifically talking about the controls. You know, how easy is it to get to the trigger, not so much the trigger pull because that's a separate consideration, but is the trigger in a decent place relative to your hand? Is the placement and tension on the safety, etc., acceptable? Bolt stop, if applicable, safety as it's applicable, charging handle, all those kinds of things. We're also going to talk about the handle itself, and by handle I mean the pistol grip, because all of these are pistol grip guns. How comfortable is that or not? And then of course the forend, how uncomfortable that is or not, we're going to talk about. We're also going to talk about the accuracy with these guns, and we're not going to talk about the accuracy with 115 grain plinking ammunition. Just because these guns, if you hunt around enough, you can eventually find a kind of ammunition that they'll like, and they'll shoot fairly accurately. I mean, all of these guns with the right ammunition are sub 5 MOA, which is for a 9mm gun, you know, for a PC3, that's acceptable. It's useful for the intended purpose. And if you want to hunt around enough, you can eventually find an ammo that they'll shoot decent enough groups with. You know, easily under 5 MOA for all of these guns. A lot of them you can get them sub 4 MOA. Occasionally you can get them sub 3 MOA depending on the particular gun, but like I said, functionally all of them can shoot sub 5 MOA with a little bit of hunting for the right ammo. What is more interesting is how they do in the recreational aspect, which is what a lot of people buy these guns for, is the recreational aspect. And for recreational purposes, you're going to usually get whatever the cheapest plinking ammo available is, and more often than not, that's 115 grain ammo. So that is where our area of emphasis is going to be. And then certainly we're going to talk about reliability, and I do want to put a caveat out there right now in that I'm talking about the guns that I have personally had a good deal of experience with. I am one person with fairly limited experience, and because of that my sample sizes are going to also be very limited. Most of the time we're talking about one individual gun and how one individual gun did or did not do. That cannot be taken as being representative of other guns that are of the exact same make and model, and it certainly cannot be taken as representative of a given company as a whole. I'm very well aware of that, but at the same time, that is the only data that I have available to me, is the data that I gather from my own experience. And so I've got to go with what I got, But at the same time, I freely admit, please hear me on this, I freely admit that my experiences regarding a gun's reliability may not be representative of that type of gun as a whole, or that company that produced it as a whole. Okay, that caveat needs to be in there, and please understand that I'm not condemning the gun as a whole or the company as a whole. I'm saying what my experiences have been. Further, we're going to talk about aftermarket support for these particular guns. Obviously, guns that have been on the market for longer are going to have more aftermarket support, but we're still going to talk about it. And then finally, we're going to talk about features, and by features I mean how easy it is to mount stuff to it. Not that we're considering it in the initial cost of the gun or necessary for having a basic functional gun, but a lot of people do like to mount extra things to guns, like say lights in the case of a defensive gun, or maybe you're one of those people that get a 9mm gun and you decide that you want to mount a bipod to it because reasons. But we'll talk about how easy it is to mount things to it. We're also going to talk about sling points. Sling points can be a very useful thing even on a 9mm recreational gun. And that is something that is worthwhile considering at the very least. I wouldn't say it's super important, but at least worthwhile considering. We're also going to talk about open sights. No, Siri, I didn't have anything to say. My phone just turned on. That's what that beep was. We're also going to consider the open sights. And the open sights are, again, something that don't get used a lot these days. Most people put some kind of an optic on their gun. But for me, the open sights are kind of a value indicator. It's not completely determinative, of course. For example, there's lots of ARs that are made right now that have no open sights on them whatsoever, and they're labeled as being optics ready. And that's the intent, is that you buy it and you put an optic on it, and we just completely skip the open sights altogether. Does that make those rifles bad because they don't have open sights? No, not necessarily, and you can certainly put them on afterwards if you want to. But that is just but for me, I really like it when companies provide decent open sights. It's one of the things I look for as a value indicator. It doesn't necessarily mean that a gun with good open sights has great value and one without has terrible, but typically, if a company cares about putting a decent set of open sights on their guns, then they're much more likely to care about other details as well. It's a value indicator. It's not value determinative, but it is a value indicator. And then last, but certainly not least, when we're talking about features, we're going to talk about last round hold open. Does this gun have last round hold open? And to me, that is a very big feature. It is important on one hand, for a recreational gun, for safety purposes. A gun that has last round hold open is much easier to check in terms of whether or not the chamber is clear. It automatically holds open. You turn the gun to the side a little bit, you look in, you can basically tell automatically whether or not the gun is empty or not. That is a good safety feature. And then, if you happen to need to change the magazine quickly for whatever reason, whether it be a defensive application or whether it be a competitive application, last round hold open type guns are typically much faster in terms of magazine changes than other kinds of guns are. And because of those two things, both the basic safety concern, is the gun unloaded or not, having a very clear indication and very clear sight that the gun is in fact unloaded, is good for safety reasons. But then there's just the simple practicality of being able to change magazines quickly, and last round hold open works for that. Alright, so those are the areas of interest. There are other things that we probably could have considered as well, and that would have made the video even longer, which we don't want to do. And then a lot of those other areas of interest that we could have considered are such that they really wouldn't have shown any great difference between the guns that we're talking about. And so if they're all essentially the same in this regard, why talk about it? For example, magazine cost. All of these guns have magazines that might be from the factory or might be from an aftermarket producer, but all of these guns are compatible with magazines that are relatively inexpensive. And so talking about things like, say, magazine cost really wouldn't be all that determinative, because they're all in the same ballpark. All of them have magazines that can be bought for $15 to $25 to get a decent functioning magazine. So there's not a whole lot of variability there. Alright, So moving on, let's actually see how all this works out. And by the way, I'm rating these on a 10 scale. Every category is going to have its 10 gun. This is the gun that is best in that category, at least says me. And then everything else is going to be evaluated according to that. So it's going to be kind of a high bias instead of a low bias. Every category has to have a 10. And there are some categories where I didn't feel like any of the guns were at the bottom of the scale. In fact, I didn't have any of a category where I felt that a gun deserved like a 1 or a 0 or something like that. So it is kind of a high bias. I just want you to understand that. Okay, without further ado, let's get into it. So we have our guns here along the left, starting with the CZ Scorpion carbine, then the CZ Scorpion pistol, both of which I currently own and currently use. Lots of good fun there. The Sub 2000 Gen 2 9mm is what I have experience with, not my own experience, I don't own it, but someone that I know happens to own a Gen 2 9mm Sub 2000, and like pretty much every single time that they have taken that gun out to shoot, I have been there with them. So yes, it is not my gun, but like all of the trigger time that the gun has, I have been there for. And then Stribog Sp9a1. I do not have the later versions with the delayed blowback and all that, which sounds really cool, and I definitely want to get my hands on one if I can. But I do not have experience with that later version, just the earlier version. The Sp9a1, what people were calling the dual recoil assembly one, is the one that I had. I do not have it anymore. However, the person who wound up getting it when I got rid of it is someone that I know, and not all the time, but a lot of times when they shoot it, I'm there with them as well. And so it was initially mine. I got rid of it, and the person that wound up with it, I still wind up shooting with them when they have it out fairly often. And then last but not least, the AKV. That is a more recent purchase, and I still currently own it. And yeah, so that brings us through the guns that we're comparing. Let's go ahead and talk about the points of difference, or at least possible points of difference. Let's talk about initial cost. With the CZ Scorpion carbine, rough estimate for me for getting the gun with a bracer stock, with a red dot, cost me about $1,150. Now, some people would say that that is not a fair price for a CZ Scorpion carbine, because a lot of people do not like a lot of the stock features. They don't like the grips, they don't like the safeties, they don't like the trigger pull, they don't like the magazine release, they don't like the forend on it, they don't necessarily like the barrel, they don't like the sides, of course, etc., etc. There's just lots of things about it that they don't necessarily like, and so they put a lot of money into getting aftermarket parts for it. And once you've done all that, it's very easy to turn the gun that cost me about $1,150 into a gun that's closer to $1,500 or maybe even $2,000. And again, the question is, what are you going for? Are you going for a completely customized gun that just fits your hand perfectly and has all the nice, neat little features that you want? Or are you looking for something that is functional? $1,150 will get you a very functional CZ Scorpion carbine. Is it going to be tailored to your specific preferences? Perhaps not, perhaps so. I personally do not mind the stock features, and so I just basically run it as is. Other people, though, they get really super picky about that kind of stuff, and picky people are going to do what picky people are going to do. So I would say expect at least $1,150. Of course, that was a while ago that I originally got it, and of course, with the situation that we're dealing with right now, all prices are higher. That needs to be understood as well. But for me, it was around $1,150. Your individual experiences are going to vary. These days, probably a bit higher, and if you're one of those people that do not like the gun in its stock configuration, yeah, you could easily be spending $1,500 to $2,000 on the gun, easy, in just aftermarket paraphernalia. And then, similar with the CZ Scorpion pistol, it usually costs a little bit more, because in its pistol form, it's not, in my experience at least, it's not usually sold with the brace. They did come out with the CZ Scorpion Pistol Micro, and in the new version of the Micro, there was another version of it where it had an extending brace on it that most people really didn't like because it was kind of flimsy. But the new version of the Micro Scorpion is being sold with this folding brace on it. It has a little bit shorter forend than what you see here. The forend on this one that's pictured is about an 8-inch forend. The new one has only like a 4-inch forend, which I personally don't like, but teach their own. If you want to buy it, go ahead and buy it. But the new one does actually come with this brace attached to it, and that can save you a little bit of money. But the way that I got mine is I bought the pistol first, and then I got the brace attached to it, and then I got the red dot for it. And so that winds up costing a little bit more. It wound up costing me about $1,200. You know, give or take a little bit, but around $1,200. And those are on the higher side of the guns that we have here. And comparative to our best gun in this category, it's still pretty high, and so I give them both 5s. They're like within $50 of each other. There's not a huge monetary advantage of getting one or the other. The nice thing about the CZ Scorpion carbine is it does come with an actual stock, because it is a rifle, it is a carbine, and so legally it can come with the stock, and so it usually does. And if you want to, you can also attach a vertical grip and things like that, because it is a legal rifle. So a little bit of availability there, but as far as cost-wise, they're both fairly high, and that's why they get 5s and not 10s. The one that did get a 10, though, is the Sub 2000. The person, like I said, it's not mine, but the person that I'm out there with, like pretty much every time that they shoot it, that person has, you know, to their name an investment of roughly $600, about $400 for the gun, and then the rest of it is made up in getting a red dot and or red dot mounting system, depending on what your red dot comes with. And out of all the guns here, that is easily the cheapest, and so it's the one that gets the 10. It is one of the least inexpensive PC3s that are on the market right now. As far as common PC3s that are out there, pistol caliber guns with third point of contact, the only gun that I know of that is, you know, similarly common and in that same ballpark as far as price or better is going to be the High Point carbine, and its standard magazine capacity is significantly less. It's only like I think it's a 10-round magazine, something like that. Not very high at all. Sub 2000 a lot of times will come with at least a 15-round magazine in the 9mm conversion, sometimes a 17-round magazine. Yeah, really, really, really good as far as price point is concerned. And then with the Stribog, when everything is said and done with that one, to get the gun, the brace, and the red dot, that winds up being pretty close to $1,000. So cheaper than the CZ Scorpions, yes, by $150, $200, but you're still going to have some kind of investment there if you want to have those basic features. So it's still kind of an expensive gun, and it's not all that different from them. So on the 10 scale, I give it a 6 out of 10. Better than the CZ Scorpions, but nowhere near as good in terms of cost as the Sub 2000 is. And then last but not least, the AKV, and the particular version that I have is basically the one that is pictured here, except I have a red dot on mine, and that is the one with the side folding triangular brace and the redwood furniture, and frankly that is a fairly expensive version of the AKV. There are other versions that do not have the folding brace. Instead they have like the Sp9a1 brace on the end that is basically attaches to an AR buffer tube kind of assembly, and that is usually a good bit cheaper, like a good $100 cheaper. And then so you won't necessarily pay this much. That's what I'm trying to get across the AKV. The particular version that I'm talking about here that I have experience with is one of the more expensive versions of it. And I also bought the AKV during the current pandemic, and that also tends to drive up prices. So it's one of the more expensive versions to begin with because it has the triangle side folding brace, and then I also bought it at like one of the worst possible times to buy a gun, and so that drives up the cost. And it is functionally the same as the CZ Scorpion carbine and the CZ Scorpion pistol, if all that you're doing is you're getting the gun, the bracer stock, and a red dot. Like I said, if you're trying to customize it beyond that, then the difference in price can climb. But if it's basically stock guns with a third point of contact and a red dot, the AKV, this version of the AKV, and the versions of the CZ Scorpion that we have here are not really all that different. Alright, so that is the issue regarding cost. Let's talk about the functional weight of these unloaded, and by functional weight, I mean that we have the gun, we have the third point of contact, we have the red dots. They could have a variety of different magazine sizes, so we're going to leave that off the table. But just as is, with the gun, with the third point of contact, with the red dot, what do they weigh approximately? We'll say to the nearest half pound. The CZ Scorpion carbine, at least on my scale, comes out to be a little over 7 pounds. That's not particularly good. Frankly, there are a lot more powerful guns out there that have the same kind of weight. For example, there are a lot of ARs out there that come in under 7 pounds or just under 7 pounds, or maybe sometimes just over, depending on what kind of optic you put on them, but a lot of times in the 7 pound range. And of course, they're ARs. They fire 5.56 ammunition. They're a lot more powerful. And so in terms of power per weight, not all that great. But I don't personally think that heavy guns can't at all be useful. I like the gun, not necessarily for, you know, for a traveling gun or something like that. The heavier it is and the bigger it is, usually the worse it is for something like that. But for a plinking gun, heavier actually isn't bad. These are blowback guns, which kind of have awful recoil. And if you get something that's heavier with, you know, some kind of a decent recoil pad on the stock, and this one doesn't have a great one, but it does have a little bit of a rubber back there, it can reduce the felt recoil and make it a little bit more pleasant to shoot that way. And then additionally, something that is overall bigger, frankly, tends to keep people safer. There's a lot of times where I go out shooting where there are kids involved. Don't worry, their legal guardians are there with them and all that kind of thing. And they're, you know, trained on how to shoot safely and all those kinds of things. But just as an added safety precaution, a lot of times I will give them a longer gun, because with longer guns you tend to be much more conscious of where you point the barrel, because it's kind of hard to avoid, because the thing is like nothing but barrel. And so for safety reasons, sometimes a longer, heavier gun is actually better. So yes, it is definitely heavy, but that heaviness can work for you, but overall we're still going to count it as a fairly negative thing. It's not, and so it gets a 6 on the 10 scale. The CZ Scorpion pistol weighs about a pound less. It is only about 6 pounds, and so comparatively speaking, that gives it an 8 on the 10 scale, and it also gets to a size and weight that for me makes it a functional traveling gun. That is, I can throw it inside of an 18-inch pistol case, and pretty much all the rest of these guns can fit in an 18-inch pistol case. The AKV down at the bottom, you have to take off the compensator that comes with the gun, and you have to put it in there kind of sideways, but it can fit in an 18-inch pistol case. All the guns below here can, and that makes them, you know, at least candidates for being a traveling bedside gun for me. Put it in an 18-inch pistol case, which can fit inside my bigger suitcase. It works. Not the lightest thing ever, but it's light enough and small enough to at least be viable. Now, the one that really takes the cake in this category is, of course, the Sub 2000. The Sub 2000 is a very light gun, and even with a red dot on it, as long as you don't have anything that's too gargantuan and huge, it's still going to weigh about 4.5 pounds, maybe 5 if you throw something really heavy on the front ends, or you have a really heavy mount. You know, you decide, I'm going to do an all-steel riser, you know, for my little plastic cheapo red dot. But whatever the case may be, and yes, I do kind of make fun of that, but I admit that I've done the same thing. You know, if you're throwing together a cheap plinking gun, you get parts based on what is cheap, not necessarily what is most functional. But it is possible to keep the gun fairly light if you want to. There's no particularly good reason why it needs to weigh more than 4.5 pounds. And that makes it the best in the weight category. Now, that does come at a cost. Very light guns tend to have more felt recoil, and that is certainly the case with the Sub 2000. And it is technically a rifle. It does have a full 16-inch barrel on it. But despite being a rifle, it doesn't have a very good recoil pad like a lot of rifles do. The buttstock on it is basically a blade of polymer. It's just plastic. There doesn't really have any rubber reinforcing back there at all, and it's fairly light, and the recoil on it is fairly notable. I mean, it's still 9mm. It's not going to, like, it's going to throw you on your backside most of the time or anything like that, but it is still enough that it is unpleasant. And so low weight means, you know, high portability, but it also means that it's not going to be very fun to use when you're actually shooting it. So pros and cons there, but if you're concerned about weight, out of the guns that are listed here, it is easily the one that is best. Next up is the Stribog Sp9a1, and it is also, along with the CZ Scorpion pistol, it's also about 6 pounds. The Streebog is technically like a couple of ounces heavier than the CZ Scorpion, but they're pretty close to the same. There's not really a lot of functional weight difference between them. But you'll notice that on the 10 scale, I give them different scores. The CZ Scorpion, I give an 8 out of 10, whereas the Streebog, I give it a 7 out of 10. Why? If their weights are functionally the same, except for maybe, you know, a couple of ounces, why rate them differently? Well, it's a matter of where that weight is placed. In the CZ Scorpion, that weight, as it does with pretty much all blowback guns, the weight is centered on the bolt. And in the CZ Scorpion, in the pistol form, well, also in the carbine form as well, but it is especially pronounced in the pistol form, that weight is behind the chamber of the barrel. The entire bolt assembly is always behind the barrel assembly. And because of that, it tends to be a very back-heavy gun by comparison. The Streebog, on the other hand, its weight is also centered in the bolt, but it has basically a two-piece bolt assembly. There's part of the bolt that sits behind the barrel assembly, but there's also part of the bolt assembly that sits above the barrel assembly, and therefore is pretty far forward on the gun. In fact, the forend that you see in the picture, there's a good part of that forend that when the gun is at rest is filled up by the bolts. So even though both of them weigh about 6 pounds, the Streebog is going to feel much, much more front heavy than the CZ Scorpion pistol is. Now, is it enough to make a difference? For some people maybe, for some people not. We're still talking about only 6 pounds total, but it is a noticeable difference between them. So even though if you're going by the nearest half pound, they're functionally identical, they do not handle identically, and that's why I gave them different scores. And then, last but not least in this category is the AKV. The AKV is a beast of a little gun in terms of weight. It is about 7 pounds. That is heavy. It is about as heavy as the full-size CZ Scorpion carbine. It is a heavy little bugger. And it is also a front-heavy little thing because it also has a telescoping bolt design like the Stribog Sp9a1 has. That is a very, 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 very heavy, very front-heavy kind of design, and overall, it's a heavy thing. And as far as typical AK pattern guns go, from what I've seen, I've actually not owned any other AK pattern guns aside from the AKV, but most AK pattern guns seem to be fairly front heavy from what I've observed, and the AKV is in line with that. But when you're comparing it with everything else here, it really is a pronounced difference. It is definitely at the top end of the spectrum in terms of overall weight, and it is also very forward heavy. And so it's just kind of odd. Like I said, it is technically such that with the the folding triangle brace on there, you can fold it up, taking off the compensator on the front end. You can technically fit it in an 18-inch pistol case, like I mentioned, at kind of an angle. It is kind of a small gun, but not really. It is, to me, it is definitely not a great traveling gun, just because it is heavy, and even though it can technically fit in a small case, it doesn't do it particularly well. And when you're holding it and using it, it definitely feels front heavy. That's not always a bad thing. The added bulk and heft is a good thing in terms of recoil mitigation and things like that. I talked about that with the full-size CZ Scorpion carbine. There are pros and cons to it, but on the whole, I would list it as being a con. Just like with this full-size CZ Scorpion carbine, there are certain applications, you know, if you have kids that are shooting with you, having a long-barreled gun, you know, can make them more barrel conscious and therefore safer. That's not all bad. Added weight can be added recoil control, especially for people who are new shooters who are a little recoil sensitive. That can be a helpful thing. But on the whole, I would not say that it is particularly good compared to the other guns that we have available here. All right, moving on to the trigger. Like I said earlier, when we talk about the trigger, we're going to primarily talk about the pull weights, but there are other things to be considered. The CZ Scorpion carbine and the CZ Scorpion pistol have basically the same trigger. It's the same main gun housing. It's just what you attach to it that basically makes it the carbine or the pistol. And so from the factory, the pull weight usually comes in somewhere between 8 and 10 pounds, and the triggers themselves, in my personal experience, have a decently well-defined breakpoint, but they are definitely kind of stagey and gritty. So all in all, not great triggers, and so I give them a 4 out of 10. They're not so bad as to be completely unusable. A lot of competitive shooters certainly wouldn't like them, but they're not unusable either. Definitely not going to be anywhere near a 10, but they are still functional, so I give them a 4 out of 10. The Sub 2000 is even worse. Maybe not a ton worse, but it is even worse. The trigger pull weight on it is usually a little bit higher, 9 to 12 pounds from what I've seen from the guns I've interacted with, and also seen people online check the pull weights and whatnot. 9 to 12 pounds usually in there somewhere. And again, it's not a particularly great trigger. It tends to be a little stagey. To me, it does not have as well a defined breakpoint as the CZ Scorpion, as the CZ Scorpions do. And so it's even worse in that regard. But at the same time, it's still functional. And if you're using the gun inside of 25 yards recreationally, it's usually not going to be a big enough deal to worry about. It can be an issue, and I have seen this with some guns, is that if you're dealing with, say, very young children or perhaps older people whose hands are arthritic and stuff like that, and just simply don't have the grip strength to pull the trigger that is that heavy, that can be a problem. But aside from that, if you're working inside of a fairly small range, 25 yards and in, and you're doing it recreationally, you're not doing it competitively, things like that, it's a workable trigger. It's definitely not great, but it'll at least serve the intended function. Going up from there, and I would say significantly, is the Stribog Sp9a1's trigger system. It's basically an AR trigger. I mean, you look at the thing, look at the trigger assembly in there, it's basically an AR trigger. And when I compare it to the actual AR that I own, I'm not really a big AR fan, but I do technically own an AR. I hardly ever take it out. Trying to remember how many times I've taken it out in the past year. Once or twice. Probably closer to once. But yeah, I'm not really an AR guy, but I do own one. And when I compare the trigger pulls from the Streebog that I used to own to the AR that I still technically own but hardly ever shoot, the trigger pulls are virtually identical. My AR is basically a mil-spec stock AR trigger, and the Streebog's trigger is, for all intents and purposes, identical to that. Just like you would expect of an AR trigger, it's a fairly short pull. It is fairly crisp. It is a little on the heavy side, 5 to 6 pounds, but it is still a very good trigger, very functional trigger, and a lot of people like that particular combination. They like something that is short, crisp, fairly well-defined breakpoints, even if it is a little on the heavy side. But it is still a little on the heavy side, so I'm going to give it a 7 out of 10. And then there's the AKV, and it's kind of the opposites. Its trigger assembly, as far as I can tell, is standard AK. Now, I don't have a normal AK to compare it with. I might need to remedy that in the future, or I may not. But as far as I know, the trigger group in it is an AK trigger, and it can be swapped out for other AK triggers, and it's pretty light. When I put it on my trigger gauge, it usually comes in somewhere between 3 and 4 pounds, usually on the higher end of that scale, just a little under 4. But it's a fairly light trigger pull, and because of that, a lot of people like it. And frankly, it makes for a pretty good bump fire trigger because it's so light. And they make even lighter triggers out there, of course, and those are really good for bump fire. But that being said, if you're trying to do precision work with it, you might come up just a little bit short because it is, you know, a typical AK trigger, and it is a fairly long trigger pull, almost kind of like a revolver-like type trigger pull. It's a very long trigger. And it also doesn't have a particularly well-defined break point. You know, you just kind of keep pulling back, and eventually somewhere in there it's going to break. And some people really like that. They think that that aids their accuracy. A lot of people, though, don't. They want it to be very, very, very well defined. They want to be able to get into the trigger and basically stage it, get it right to where they want to, you know, finish cleaning up the sight picture to get it sighted in exactly where they want, and then take it over the edge right then when they're finally got everything lined up and ready. And I'm personally am kind of one of those people, and that's one of the reasons why I personally would actually like the Streebog trigger over the AKV trigger, but technically the AKV trigger is lighter. So I'm going to give it the 10 on the scale, but like I said, if you're looking at the secondary characteristics of the trigger, not just the pull weight, there is a good argument to be made for saying that the Streebog trigger is actually functionally, for a lot of people, better than the AKV trigger. But that's also going to be somewhat of a subjective thing, so I'll just leave it at the weights, and you guys can decide what you want to go from there. Field strip. The CZ Scorpions for field stripping, whether it be the carbine version or the pistol version, are virtually the same. It's the same process. You pull back on the charging handle, putting it into the locking notch, which the CZ Scorpion actually has, which I like, some people don't. But you lock the charging handle back, you pull out a cross pin, basically the fire control group comes out. You pull out the bolts, and that's it. That's all there is to do. You just got 3 pieces that you're dealing with when you field strip the gun to do normal maintenance and cleaning on it. Very simple in that regard. Now it is, of course, blowback, and the CZ Scorpion pistol, I would say, is especially a dirty gun. And it is dirty. It just blows stuff all over the place. And if you get these nice clear magazines, like are the ones that are in the picture, they will have carbon all over the upper portion of them. You know, part in the magwell and even coming down out of the magwell a little bit, depending on how much you shoot. It'll just be filled with carbon. So yeah, the magwell gets utterly filthy, the magazine gets utterly filthy, the chamber area gets utterly filthy, even back behind the bolts you'll have stuff that gets blown back there that is terrible. The bolt itself gets covered. Yeah, it's a blowback gun, and CZ Scorpion is famous for being especially dirty. But the nice thing about it is that it is easy to take apart and put back together, and so even though it does get really dirty, it's pretty easy to deal with. The Sub 2000 is kind of like the worst of all possible worlds when it comes to its field strip. I will give it some credit in that it is technically a toolless field strip. You do not technically have to have any tools to do it, although having the tip of a cartridge or something like that can be handy for it. But it is technically a toolless takedown system, and so I will give them credit for that. But that being said, that's like the only good thing I can say about the field stripping process on the Sub 2000. It is technically toolless, or with a cartridge if you prefer. But after that, it just gets annoyingly complicated and terrible. It has a bunch of little pieces and parts. I think there's like 7 or 9 parts when you get the thing taken apart. And I actually have done this. I've actually done this a couple of times. It's not my gun, but I have taken it apart and cleaned it and helped them take it apart and clean it. And it's a process. Like I said, there's like 7 to 9 parts in there that you have to take apart for general field stripping. And it is such a small and compact gun, which makes it handy for carrying around, but it's so small and compact that cleaning in and around those surfaces can become a real major chore. It's just generally not pleasant at all. And of course, it's blowback on top of that, and all blowback guns just shoot dirty. And so you get really small pieces and parts, a bunch of pieces and parts that are really super dirty because it's blowback, and it just makes for a rather miserable experience. Like I said, I'll give them kudos for having something that is technically, just barely, but technically toolless, but after that it's pretty much downhill from there. So I give it a 4 out of 10. The Streebog, on the other hand, I wouldn't say it's quite as easy to field strip as the CZ Scorpion is, but it's pretty close. Its field strip is pretty similar, and it's actually very AR-like. There's a pin at the back of the lower receiver that you pop out, and then you pull off either the brace or the stock, depending on how you have it configured, and then you pull out the bolt assembly, and that's it. There's only 3 main parts that you actually have to take apart. Now, there is technically a pin at the front of the lower receiver as well, but it's usually best to leave that pin in there because it attaches to a few other things, and it's usually not worth trying to mess with. And that can get in the way of cleaning a little bit when you have these 2 pieces flopping around together. But all in all, it's really not terrible, and there are a few angles that are odd, but if you have a good cleaning toolkit with some good cleaning brushes and patches and those kinds of things, a lot of that can be mitigated very easily. And I personally, and different people are going to have different opinions on this, but I personally feel that even though the Streebog is still blowback like all the other guns, I personally don't feel that it gets the gun as dirty in the process of shooting as, say, the Sub 2000 does, or even the CZ Scorpions do. Those ones, I would say, are especially dirty guns, especially the CZ Scorpion. The Streebog does not seem to get as dirty. It's still blowback, it's still going to be dirty, but it doesn't seem like it gets as dirty to me. Other people, though, that I've talked to don't like cleaning it a whole lot either, just because of the dirtiness aspect, and, different people are going to perceive it differently, but I perceive it as not being quite as dirty of a gun. It's still blowback, so yeah, it's still going to be awful, but it is better than some of its competitors in that regard. But still technically not quite as easy to assemble and disassemble as the CZ Scorpion, but still pretty good. And then the AKV, I would kind of say is upper middle of the road. It doesn't have a ton of parts when you take it apart. It's 4 instead of 3 parts. The Streebog and the CZ Scorpion, when you take them apart for field stripping, you're left with 3 parts on the table there. The AKV, it's 4 parts, and the 4th part is what would normally be a gas tube on a normal AK, but since this one's blowback, it's not actually a true gas tube. Instead, it's more of a guide tube. But that is part of the issue. But what gets me about it is just the process that is involved. In the AKV, spring tension is basically how the dust cover is held in place, and so you kind of have to fight the dust cover to get the thing open to clean it in the first place, and then you've got to fight that recoil spring so that you can extract it, and it's kind of a weird dangly thing, and this is typical for AKs in general. Don't get me wrong in this one. It's a problem with all AKs. It's not just the AKV that does this, that has kind of this weird spindly recoil spring thing going on. And then on top of that, it is a truly dirty gun. It just blows debris all over into the receiver, into the dust cover. The bolt is filthy. The magazine well is not in a good place. And then, of course, that little guide tube that is up there, it gets filled with crud and dirt as well. There is no part on the innards of that gun that is safe from debris at all. When you open it up to clean it, you're just going to have a chore. If you put any considerable number of rounds through it, it's going to be a dirty little thing. And it does technically have more parts than some of the other guns that we have here in terms of what you have to take apart for field stripping. Not as bad as the Sub 2000. That one pretty much takes the cake in this regard. It's not that bad. And it is still technically toolless. But the fact that you have to fight the springs so much with it, and it is a really dirty gun, and it gets dirty all over. There's no organization to it whatsoever. That takes it down a little bit in my book. Now, is that bad enough to keep people from enjoying it and shooting it? Probably not. But the manual for the AKV recommends that you clean it at least once a week, even if you're not shooting it, which I personally think is excessive, but that's what they recommend. And if you're going to be spending that much time cleaning a gun, I would prefer something that is simpler. Okay. The Stribog is simpler, the CZ Scorpion is simpler, so that makes the AKV kind of middle of the road. Right, and then ergonomics. Ergonomics, like I said, I'm focusing primarily on the controls, the handle, the forend, things like that. On the CZ Scorpion, I personally like it. However, almost everyone that I hand the CZ Scorpion to, they find it functional and workable, but when you ask them what their preference is in terms of ergonomics, out of all the guns that are on the table, so to speak, it's usually not at the top of the list. It might be on the top of the list for other things, but ergonomics is not its strong suit. Fully admit that one. Like I said, personally I don't mind them, but a lot of people don't like them. It does have, a very functional safety system, and it has a very definite safety. I mean, you really feel and know and hear that the safety has been engaged. The magazine catch is a very solid catch. It's a little hard to get a hold of because it's a snag-free design, but it is still very functional. I love the bolt release on it, and most people do. Some parts of the ergonomics are definitely not so great, especially for some people, but the last round bolt hold open and bolt release system is excellent on the CZ Scorpion, and is one of the things I do have to give it good credit for and kind of bump up its score because of that. But the other things are usually not generally preferred. Like I said, the safety is very definite, but it's a double-sided safety, and so it often will dig into your hand on the other side. And if you're a competitive shooter that puts, thousands of rounds downrange in a day, yeah, that can be a real problem. If you're someone who, goes out and shoots 50 rounds, 100 rounds, maybe 200 rounds max, I don't think it's really going to bother you all that much, especially if you're only doing it incidentally. But for other people, I can see where it would be a big problem. So safety becomes an issue. Like I said, the magazine release, which is basically flush with the trigger guard here, is kind of a paddle style, but it doesn't protrude and down, so it can be a little hard for people to get a good hold of. The charging handle is fairly small. Again, it's a snag-free design, but it's so small that some people don't like dealing with it at all. It's just too small. Lots of people like changing the ergonomics on the CZ Scorpion. That being said, as ergonomically idiosyncratic as the CZ Scorpion can be, it's still very functional. Okay. Yes, the charging handle might be a little small, but it's in a good place and it's not overly difficult to use. Yes, the magazine catch doesn't protrude like you might want it to, but it is still very functional. The safety can be annoying, especially if you have a high volume of fire, but it is still very functional. It works just fine, and it is more or less in a place that you would expect it to be. Give it a little bit of time with the gun, most people can figure it out just fine and work it just fine. In contrast to that, though, is the Sub 2000. The Sub 2000's controls in some ways are more ergonomic in the sense of just holding on to them, touching them, shooting with them. You don't have an offside safety that digs into your trigger finger like you do with the Scorpion, things like that. But there's some parts of the way they operate that is just downright goofy. I mean, the Sub 2000, for lack of a more gracious way of putting it, is basically a tactical broomstick. That's what it is. It is a rod. and they attached a pistol grip to it and a butt stock to it. That's basically all that it is. And so no, I wouldn't call it overly ergonomic. And the two areas where I would fault it the most, isn't the handle. The pistol grip on it is decent, and a lot of people would say better than the pistol grip on the CZ Scorpion. And the fore end it's small, but it's also not awful. But the two areas where I would definitely give it a failing, a failing grade in terms of ergonomics are the safety and the charging handle. The safety is a crossbolt safety, and I cannot tell you how many times I have seen people mess up whether or not the gun is unsafe. And this happens a lot with crossbolt guns being mixed with guns that have a typical lever type safety. If you have combinations where people are using both kinds of guns, the crossbolt safety is usually the one that they will wind up messing up with in the real world situation. And frankly, if you can't operate the safety correctly, that does create a safety problem. Now, granted, if you follow the 4 basic rules of firearm safety, you shouldn't be relying on a mechanical safety, and so it shouldn't result in anybody dying, but I like to know whether or not my gun is unsafe, and I don't want there to be any doubt about it. And a lot of people, it doesn't work out that way. Now it does have a little red ring around one side of the crossbolt safety to say that this is the side that is on fire, that is out when the gun is on fire, I should say. And that can help a little bit if you're looking for it, but it is not something that is readily apparent. You actually kind of have to twist the gun a little bit sideways to see that little red ring. It's just not super obvious and clear. And do not like it. And like I said, I've had people go out and say, okay, the gun is on safety, or hand me the gun and say it's unsafe. And I look at it, it's like, no, it's not unsafe. I've seen people mess it up just time and time and time again. Crossbolt safeties in an environment where you have the lever type safeties are usually the ones that wind up being applied incorrectly. And so I do not like them because of that. I'm not saying that you can't train around it. If it's the only gun you have, well, it'll be pretty easy, with a little bit of time and training to figure out which way is safe and which way is not and all that. But like I said, if you're mixing it with other gun types, that's usually when you start running into problems. And so that's a little bit odd, especially for the kind of gun that it is, that it would have a crossbolt safety. But even bigger than that is the charging handle. The charging handle is this little nub that is on the back portion of the gun underneath it, and the charging handle is a reciprocating charging handle, meaning that every time the gun fires, that charging handle is going to come slamming back and slamming forward. And so if you have someone who happens to be shooting and has long hair, their hair can get caught in that charging handle and take their head for a little bit of a ride. If they happen to put their hand in the wrong spot in the course of firing, that can create problems as well. And then it is just awkwardly placed, and it is a very heavy recoil spring that the Sub 2000 has. And so the placement, the fact that it is a reciprocating instead of a non-reciprocating handle, the weight of it, all those things combined to make it just exceptionally awkward and just downright painful to use. And for some people, they can't even operate it that I've been out with. And it's usually people who are either older or have arthritis, things like that. But it's so bad that they can't really operate it. Now, one of the things that is nice about that charging handle being on the back side of the gun is that if you absolutely have to, you can operate it with your foot. Stick the butt end of the gun on the ground, and then just pump that charging handle with your foot if you need to. That works. The only problem with that, though, is that if you're sticking the butt end of the gun on the ground, then you're pointing the barrel back up and potentially back up at you, and so that creates a little bit of a safety thing. And combine that with a crossbolt safety that a lot of people mess up on and saying that it's unsafe when it really isn't, that's just kind of a potential problem waiting to happen if you wind up with someone who decides to foot charge the weapon. So possible yes, ideal no. So ergonomically, There's a lot of parts of the Sub 2000 that are not terrible. Like I said, the grip isn't a bad grip. The forend is a little small, but it's not terrible. The magazine release is basically where you would expect it to be on an auto-loading pistol. Those aspects of the ergonomics are okay, but the crossbolt safety and the awkward placements of the charging handle that is also very heavy and a reciprocating charging handle make it far less than ideal. So I give it a 4 out of 10. On the complete opposite side of the spectrum is the Stribog Sp9a1. Its controls, at least as far as placement is concerned, is very AR-esque. If you're used to an AR, you're going to be looking for the controls in basically the same place. They might be oriented just a little different, might operate just a little different, but they're pretty close. The safety is basically an AR safety. It's a little plasticky feeling, but it's still basically an AR safety. The magazine release, which it has on both sides, is basically index finger operated in a manner very similar to a standard AR. The bolt release is not the same as a standard AR, but it is located basically in the same place on either side of the gun, and it is not overly difficult to use. A lot of people don't like how small it is. It's kind of got a little thin metal lip that you push on to activate it, and a lot of people will get an extended version of it that has an extended metal lip. But other than that, it's basically like running an AR. And the handle that is on it is very similar to what is on a lot of ARs, or at least similar to the handles that people wind up swapping onto ARs. The controls themselves are very AR-esque. The front end of it, of course, has Picatinny rail, and it is an aluminum receiver that you're holding onto, so it can be a little cheese gratery, but it's usually not terrible. So, out of all the guns here, I would say that ergonomically speaking, the Streebog is the best, ergonomically speaking. I personally am not a huge fan of AR ergos, and so I'm not overly attached to it. But it does function, it works, and I can hand that kind of a gun to pretty much anyone. I can hand a Streebog to pretty much anyone who has any kind of familiarity with the AR platform, or even not, and they'll usually get used to running it pretty quickly, pretty easily, and pretty seamlessly. So it's not bad in that regard. And then behind it a little bit, in terms of ergonomics, would be the AKV. And the main reason why I would say it is behind the Streebog is because it's an offhand system, like all AKs in fact are. Can't speak today. AKs by their nature have right-hand charging handles, and if you're right-handed, that kind of puts it on the wrong side depending on how you like to charge it. And then the safety is, you know, the huge lever on the side of the receiver, which is very obvious and very easy to get a hold of and things like that, but it's kind of wrong-sided. So, functional, yes. Are you going to make a mistake as to whether it is on safe or not? It's really hard to do, given just how big and huge and obvious the safety is. So in those regards, it works out, but it is kind of wrong-handed. And that's basically the only thing that I would fault the AKV on in terms of ergonomics. Well, that, and also the handle, for me, tends to be a little bit on the small side. And given how front-heavy the gun is, I don't like that. There are a lot of people, though, that don't really control the gun by the pistol grip. They'll control it by the third point of contact and their forend, and there's a lot of good sense to that. But I like being able to control the gun with the pistol grip as well. And for that purpose, that pistol grip that it comes with is a bit on the small side, a bit uncomfortable. But that's more nitpicking than anything else. So, not bad, but not as good as the Streebog. And for a lot of people, just because of how big and obvious and still very functional the controls are, they still wind up liking it more than the CZ Scorpion. Alright, let's talk about accuracy. And like I mentioned before, I'm going to talk about accuracy with 115 grain ammunition, because that is most of what you're probably going to be running through these guns. The CZ Scorpion carbine, with its 16+ inch barrel, fortunately gives its rounds plenty of burn time. That is one of the advantages of a long barrel. A long barrel can actually retard velocity a little bit and therefore muzzle energy a bit, But the trade-off is that you have more burn time, which means a more consistent burn, which often translates into greater functional accuracy, especially with loads that are not necessarily so innately accurate, like 115 grain target loads or plinking loads. And so I would say that the CZ Scorpion carbine with 115 grain ammunition, out of the guns that are here, is actually pretty decent, and I would go so far as to say the best. Now, part of that may also have to deal with the sights and cheek weld and things like that. There's, you know, without actually getting a gun set up in a vise, it's very hard to be super specific about that. And so some of the other guns may in fact actually be better, but functionally it is the one that seems to be the most accurate with 115 grain ammunition. I'll put it that way. And then the CZ Scorpion pistol is kind of not the same. I wouldn't say that any of the guns here are terrible with 115 grain ammunition. If you're talking about the ranges at which people usually use PC3s, they're all going to be functional, so I'll give them, you know, a 6 or higher. But the CZ Scorpion pistol doesn't seem to like 115 grain ammunition all that well, and a lot of it has to do with the fact that it does have a shorter barrel than its carbine length cousin. And that shorter barrel does not give you quite as much burn time, and so you don't have quite as much consistency, and it also doesn't seem to just stabilize 115 grain all that super well. It's not uncommon for the CZ Scorpion pistol with at least some 115 grain loads to have an accuracy that's somewhere sometimes in the 10 MOA area, which is not great. Now, if you up it to like 124 grain ammunition or do a more specialized load, it can be lighter, but actually specialized defensive load or something like that, your group size will shrink dramatically. But there are a lot of 115 grain loads that it just does not like all that well. For the intended purpose, functional, but not great. Right, the Sub 2000 again is a gun that has a much longer barrel. It's a 16+ inch barrel, and so it tends to do pretty well with 115 grain ammunition. 115 grain ammunition oftentimes isn't, you know, all that super accurate, especially if you're getting just plinking ammo, target ammo. But that extra burn time in the barrel does lead to greater consistency, and so it is actually pretty spot on most of the time. It holds pretty well. There are some issues with getting a proper cheek well on it and things like that that can become a bit of an issue in the accuracy department, but it is usually pretty close to the CZ Scorpion carbine, maybe a little bit less. That's why I gave it a 9 instead of a 10, but it's pretty stinking close in terms of dealing with 115 grain ammo. The Stribog Sp9a1, though, when it comes to accuracy with 115 grain ammo, is definitely the worst of the bunch here. I wouldn't say so terrible as to be utterly unusable, but it is markedly bad. The problem that I had with mine was that with 115 grain ammunition, especially at distance, you would start to pick up some horizontal stringing. And that horizontal stringing was sometimes severe enough that depending on the target distance and the target size, it could pull you off target with at least some of your shots, and that's not so great. Now, that problem was easily remedied in going up to 124 grain ammunition or 147 or something like that, or like I said, a very specific defensive load or a very consistent load that someone had cooked up, something like that. But there are lots of 115 grain ammunitions that it didn't particularly like, and it did not shoot very well with. Like I said, horizontal stringing was the primary problem. But that only tended to really show up at range. If you're close enough, it's not that big of an issue. If it's like 50 yards and beyond, yeah, you can see some horizontal stringing that can wind up affecting things. But like I said, typical range for a lot of these is closer to 25 yards and in, and if that's what you're doing with it, it'll be more than adequate for that purpose. So I wouldn't put it in the bottom category. I wouldn't say it's 5 or below, because it is still functional for the intended purpose. But out of the ones here, yeah, it's the worst with 115 grain ammunition. Now, the AKV is kind of an oddball. It turns out that it's a little ammo sensitive, and we'll talk about this in reliability more. Turns out it's a little ammo sensitive, and the ammo that it runs best with is not particularly accurate ammo to start with. And I personally feel that given the innate limitations of the ammo that it likes, because it likes steel case ammo instead of brass case ammo, given the limitations of the ammo that it likes, I would say that it's actually fairly accurate. The problem is just that it likes kind of bad ammo that's not overly consistent, and so your accuracy suffers for that reason. So that's why I have the 8 with the asterisks. I feel that the accuracy with 115 grain is pretty decent, but the 115 grain ammunition that it actually likes to run isn't very good to begin with, so it doesn't wind up being functionally as good as the Sub 2000 or the CZ Scorpion carbine. Not bad, but the fact that it doesn't like a better quality ammunition, ironically, kind of holds it back. All right, and that leads us into reliability. The CZ Scorpion carbine that I have yet to date to have a single malfunction with it. And granted, I don't use my guns a super ton, usually 100 to 200 times in a range session, and so I'm not stretching it out as much as some people do. They'll do 1,000 or 2,000 rounds, over the course of just a few days. I don't usually do that, and so I haven't tested them out super hard, but the CZ Scorpion carbine has been perfectly reliable for me. I have not had any malfunctions with it whatsoever, so if that's not a 10 out of a 10, I don't know what is. The case has not been exactly the same with my CZ Scorpion pistol. Again, it does not exactly have the habit of malfunctioning, but I admit that I have had some malfunctions with the CZ Scorpion pistol. And it doesn't do it very often, and so it's really hard to identify exactly what the cause is. There was a couple of malfunctions that I had literally in the first magazine, and I kind of originally thought that, well, okay, maybe that's a break-in issue, but CZ Scorpions aren't known for having a break-in period anyways, so that was kind of odd. And if it is a break-in issue, it usually happens in more than just one magazine, so that was kind of odd. And then I got to thinking, well, the ammo that I put in that first magazine was not particularly good ammo. It had been fed through a bunch of other guns and chewed up pretty good, so it wasn't particularly good ammo. Maybe that was the reason. And then just recently, when I was out shooting with a friend of mine, I let him shoot it, and he had one malfunction with it. We shot it quite a bit more that day, but he had one malfunction with it, and that's, I think, when I was able to put a little bit more together. He was holding the gun in a particular way, such that he was basically grabbing onto the magazine. And I noticed that the magazine that I was using in it was the same magazine that I did malfunction with before, and that particular magazine was a little bit loose in the gun. It was one of the Magpul magazines, which doesn't mean that all Magpul magazines are bad, but just some of the earlier production Magpul magazines, maybe you should be a little bit cautious of them. But that is what I think I've narrowed it down to, because it seems to do just fine with the standard CZ factory magazines. It also does fine with the PSA U9 magazines. I've not tried any of the Manticore magazines in my CZ Scorpions, because the Manticore magazines have produced trouble for some people. You can look online of people who have done large volume magazine testing with the guns, and the Manticore magazine will produce malfunctions from time to time. Not a huge amount, but from time to time. And so, as far as I can tell, it's a magazine related issue with a magazine that seems to be a little bit out of spec. That's easily solved, but I'm not. So I would be tempted to give the CZ Scorpion pistol a 10 out of 10. Just say, run standard factory magazines in it and you'll be perfectly fine, which seems to be true. But technically, I've had malfunctions with it, so I'm going to drop it to an 8, and just in the interest of accuracy. But like I said, as far as I can tell, it is completely mitigatable. Don't run the Magpul magazines in it. Instead, run the factory magazines or the PSA magazines, and you'll be perfectly fine from what I've seen. But I have had those malfunctions, so reporting it as such. The Sub 2000 is similar. It runs off of Glock magazines, and Glock magazines are good. However, to be accurate, to be fair, to provide full disclosure, the person who owns it, that I usually go shooting with, fairly often whenever they shoot it, I'm usually there, they have had some malfunctions. And again, this is something that I think is completely mitigatable. Those malfunctions only occurred with truncated flat nose bullets. That's it. And those are not the kinds of bullets that you would expect to run well in an auto-loading pistol kind of design anyways. And so you wouldn't really expect it to run well in this platform either. And as much as I do appreciate Glock magazines, there is a problematic fact with them, and that is that they are single feed magazines. Unlike the magazines for all of the other guns here that are double stack double feeds, Glock magazines are double stack but single feed point magazines, and because of that they're going to be a little bit more sensitive to bullet shape and design than some of the other magazines are. That's just an innate problem. And so yeah, the truncated cone type bullets that are out there, the ones with the flat walls, the semi-wad cutter designs, you wouldn't expect them to run great in a semi-auto platform anyways, and Sub 2000 isn't all that different in that regard. So did we have those malfunctions? Technically we did, but it was with ammunition that you wouldn't expect to run very well anyways. So I can forgive it for that, but in the interest of being accurate, I give it an 8 instead of a 10 because we did technically have those malfunctions. The Streebog also has kind of an interesting case. Initially, and if you guys watch my videos you know this, initially I was pretty critical of the Streebog in terms of reliability because it would malfunction when I bump fired. Well, as I got better at bump firing and found out how to bump fire all the other guns, it turns out that pretty much all of them will have issues with bump firing in one way or another. Bump firing is just not a normal condition for the guns to be in, and particularly in the way that guns cycle. They're designed to be braced against something, and when you're bump firing they're not braced against anything, and that tends to induce malfunctions. They're not designed to operate that way, and the Streebog would not operate perfectly when I bump fired it. In particular, it would eject the spent case sometimes, but sometimes it wouldn't pick up the next one. The bolt simply wouldn't come far enough back. But given that other guns do it too, like pretty much all of the guns that are here will malfunction under bump fire conditions, I've since decided, you know, that's not really a fair thing to criticize the Streebog for. So if you're operating the Streebog as it is intended to be operated, which is not bump firing it, it is actually a really reliable gun with a very wide variety of ammunition. I've got to give it props on that. Now the reason why I'm putting it at a 9 instead of a 10, and I'm putting the little asterisk there, is because even though you can run just about anything out of it, and as long as you're operating it normally, you're not bump firing it, it will do just fine. There is one critical failure point with regard to its reliability, and that is the magazine design. Some people have not had any issues with their Streebog magazines, and if that is you, awesome, good for you. But in my experience, I've had the feed lips of the magazines crack, and then now that somebody else has the gun, they've gotten their old magazines to actually split along the back, along the spine. And of course, that's going to lead to some significant reliability problems. That's not really the gun's fault, that's the magazine's fault, but it means that you're not going to be able to fire the gun when you want to, at the time that you want to. If you go click and there is no bang, ultimately there's a reliability issue there. It might be localized to the magazine, but it's still a part of the problem. And we're going to get more into this when we talk about aftermarket support. But the factory magazines, for some people under some conditions, do break. And I admit that I am typically much harder on magazines, especially polymer magazines, than a lot of people are, because this was a gun that I took traveling with me. And when I travel by car. And so it is sitting in the back of my car, bouncing around in there for 40 to 60 hours a week. That is really hard on any piece of equipment, but when you're talking about a plastic magazine, that kind of repetitive motion can be very problematic. And the walls of the Streebog magazines are a little bit on the thin side, so you get some bulging. You introduce some vibration into that bulge as well, and yeah, you can split magazines pretty easily. And also the feed lips are not particularly strong, and so if you leave them fully loaded for an extended period of time, they're going to weaken. And this technically happens with all magazines. Magpul actually made some changes to their AR magazines recently, where in the latest generation that came out, they actually included a little cover piece for the magazine, so that when the magazine is not in use and you want to leave it fully loaded, you can put the little cover on it and it will basically save the feed lips. That's the purpose for the little cover on the new Magpul magazines. And like I said, it happens with all polymer magazines eventually. The problem with the Streebog magazines, though, is that their polymer is a little bit thinner than on a lot of other guns, and so it tends to happen sooner, and it tends to be more susceptible to things like vibration and stuff like that. So if you use it as a traveling gun, like I did, be prepared to trade out your magazines fairly often, to maybe download the magazines so they're not under as much stress, and then also buy some extras, and keep them off to the side for a rainy day for when your main ones go down, because eventually they will, and that's true of all magazines. Eventually they're all going to eventually break. It's just a matter of when. In my experience, the Streebog tends to have them break down more often than others. Okay, like I said, is that really the gun's fault? Technically, no, it's the magazine's fault. But it's going to perhaps keep you from firing when you want to fire, and ultimately that is still a reliability issue. So I can't give it a full 10 on that one. I would give it a full 10 if we give it the qualification that you have magazines that are in good working order in it. If that's the case, yeah, 10 out of 10. It's a very reliable gun in my experience. Like I said, if you're not bump firing it and you have magazines that are in good working order, it is a fantastically reliable gun that can feed all kinds of ammo. I don't think that its operational range is quite as wide as the CZ Scorpion, because the CZ Scorpion can eat anything from 65 grain ammo all the way up to 165 grain ammo. The CZ Scorpion can eat anything, and it doesn't matter if it's aluminum case or brass case or steel case. CZ Scorpion will eat anything under the sun. So I don't think that the Streebog is quite that good, but it is pretty stinking close. It is pretty good, with the exception of course, bump firing it, which is true for all of these guns. You can get them all to malfunction under bump fire conditions. And make sure that the magazines are in good working order. If that's the case, you're going to have a very good gun. The AKV, on the other hand, I have not had good experience with, and you guys who have watched my videos before know that I haven't had good experiences with AKV when it comes to reliability. It does not seem to like the cheap brass plinking ammunition. The plinking ammunition that I would normally use for all of my other guns, like Remington green and white box and Winchester white box, that, like I said, they run fine in all of my other guns, but in the AKV, they produce malfunctions of one kind or another. With the Remington, it is usually light primer strikes. With the Winchester white box, it's a weird feeding malfunction that kind of bends the round in the action of the gun, and it'll get caught up on the lip of the brass, the rim of the brass of the cartridge, and it'll distend it and bend it out in weird places, and it's just all kinds of bizarre. So that I don't like, and it certainly doesn't make me feel very comfortable about using defensive ammunition in it, because most defensive ammunition is brass. Now granted, if you test a couple hundred rounds of it and it turns out okay, well then okay, I just don't know too many people that have the spare money to blow through 200 rounds of their favorite defensive ammunition to test it, and so because of that, I don't really trust it in any serious application. That being said, and this is the reason why I have the asterisks on it, I would say that the reliability overall is poor, not what I would expect of a gun, and especially a gun that is in this price category. But all that being said, it actually runs supremely well with steel case ammunition. I've put a ton of Wolf Poly Performance military classic 9mm through it, and it just eats the stuff up. No hiccups, no nothing. It's just smooth. It's fantastic. I wish it would do it with brass, but it doesn't. But with the steel case stuff, it runs very well. And so as a recreational gun, you know, the nice thing about steel case ammunition is that it's super cheap. And so as a recreational gun, that works. It's functional in that regard. I wouldn't trust it for serious use, but it does have reliability with at least some kinds of ammunition that are practical to buy, very cheap to buy, and so kudos on that. But overall, is it something that I would trust for serious use, like self-defense or maybe hunting or something like that, or maybe even competition, depending on what you're allowed to put through the gun? Maybe, maybe not. But that also is a sample size of 1. PSA has a pretty good reputation for fixing their mistakes. My problem is that they also have a reputation for making those mistakes in the first place, and I really don't like that business model of, you know, make it cheap and fix it later. Is not a business model that I personally appreciate. Some people are okay with it, you know, saves them money, and if the company's willing to repair it on their dime, okay, you know, that's the way a lot of people think of it, but I don't. I like to buy my firearm, shoot my firearm, be happy with my firearm. Not buy my firearm, shoot my firearm, be very dissatisfied with my firearm, call people, have the gun sent in, have them send it back to me, shoot it again, and maybe, maybe not be happy with it. I do not like that business model. But like I said, PSA does have a reputation, to be fair, of fixing their mistakes. So if I wanted to go that route, I probably could. But I tend to judge guns based on what they sent out the first time, not after you send it back 2 or 3 times. So that's the way, and that's where we stand on that one. All right, aftermarket support. For the CZ Scorpions, for both the carbine and the pistol, the aftermarket support is huge right now. The CZ Scorpions have been on the market for a long time, and because of that, you can replace just about anything on the gun that you want to. They're almost, not really as good as this, but they're still coming pretty close to the kind of adaptability that you get with ARs. I mean, you can get all kinds of different stocks now, or all kinds of different braces now. Some versions that are adjustable, some are not. You can get different pistol grips for them. Of course, 1,000, 1 million different kinds of sighting systems. You can get different safeties. You can get different magazine catches. You can get different forends. You can get different barrel lengths. You can change just about every single stinking thing on the gun that you want to. So in terms of aftermarket support, there is lots of stuff that is out there. I will admit perfectly honestly right now that I do not like the vast majority of it, and I especially don't like it when the company itself starts including the aftermarket stuff before it gets to the consumer. And my reason for that is that a lot of times, with my experience with CZs, especially the Scorpions, the CZ Scorpions, is that when you put a lot of aftermarket stuff on it, especially internal to the gun when you start messing with the springs, and also the magazine catch is a big thing as well. The springs and the magazine catch, if you start messing with that, you can really significantly wind up messing with the reliability of the gun. A lot of the other changes are not going to affect the gun that much. You know, if you want to put a different stock on there, you know, that's not going to affect the reliability to any great extent. But messing with the springs, and I understand why people like to do it, because the trigger pull on the CZ Scorpion is very heavy. I understand why they do it. But if you mess with the springs, and if you mess with the magazine catch, you can produce a lot of problems. The CZ Scorpion does seem to be sensitive to magazine-related issues. And so if you have a magazine catch in there that might be easier to get a hold of because it's a duckbill paddle style instead of the low-profile snag-free one that comes stock with it, you might be able to get a hold of it better. But if it causes the magazine to sit too high in the gun, and this is usually where the problem occurs, if it causes the magazine to sit too high in the gun, it will wind up interfering with the bolts as it travels back under recoil, and you can actually get stovepipes and weird things like that. It'll manifest in strange ways. And then with the springs, if you lighten up the springs too much, sometimes you'll fire the gun a little too quickly. And the CZ Scorpion, while it does have a drop safety in it that kind of sort of doubles as a in battery safety, it really isn't. And technically you can fire rounds in the CZ Scorpion out of battery, and you can do that with a lot of guns. Okay, don't dig CZ for that. the Streebog does not have, as far as I know, it does not have a drop safety or an in-battery safety, and the AKV, as far as I know, does not have a drop safety or an in-battery safety. Okay, so don't dig them for that. But on the CEC Scorpion carbine, it is also in that similar in that it doesn't have a true in-battery safety, and if you fire at the wrong points in the firing sequence, you can have an out-of-battery detonation, and it's a polymer gun, it's plastic, it'll blow the thing up. But that typically only happens with people that are doing the bump fire thing, and especially doing the bump fire thing with a lightened trigger so that they can do it even faster. Those kinds of modifications. If you leave it in its stock form, you can't fire it as quickly, which means that you're not going to have a lot of those kinds of problems. It's much, much, much less likely. So yeah, if you're going to modify it, be very cautious about messing with springs. I know the temptation is there because that trigger pull is so heavy, but be cautious about that. And if you do mess with the trigger pull, I would really suggest that you stay away from bump firing it if you mess with the springs. And then the magazine catch. The magazine catch, if it's out of spec, can cause a lot of problems in terms of reliability because it'll push the magazines too far into the gun, and you'll get a lot of stovepipes and things like that. And the only aftermarket magazine catch that I've seen that be a real big problem with is actually the Magpul one, which is strange because Magpul usually does really good stuff. But it turns out that the Magpul magazine catch with the CZ Scorpion and also the Magpul magazines, depending on the combinations and the specific gun, sometimes do lead to reliability issues. Other than that, though, you can change basically anything you want on the gun and customize it to your little heart's content. It will add expense. Okay, these initial estimates of $1150 or $1200 are definitely going to go out the door, but you can modify them very easily nowadays. The Sub 2000 has also been on the market for a little while now, and because of that, its aftermarket support isn't as great as the CZ Scorpion, but there are a lot of options out there. For example, one of the things that are out there are raised open sights, because the open sights that are on it look kind of tall, but when you're actually firing it, you find that you really have to get your cheek right down on that receiver tube, and it's kind of uncomfortable to get that low on it. And so there are a lot of people that make raised sights for it. You can also get covers for the receiver tube because it's bare metal as it is, and depending on the outside temperature, if it's really cold or really hot, that might not be so great. So they make covers for the receiver tube. They also make specialized mounts because it's a folding gun. You can see that in the picture here. It's a folding gun, and they'll make special mounts that'll basically wrap around the gun so that you can still put optics and whatnot on it, and those kinds of things. And so there actually is a decent amount of aftermarket support for it. You can get extended charging handles, things like that. So there's a decent amount there. It is adaptable. The Streebog does not have a lot of aftermarket support right now. Part of that is just because of newness. There is some that is out there, like HB Industries has some aftermarket parts, like the bolt stop. Like I said, is a little small for some people. They want one that's a little bit more extended. They do make those. But the reason why I don't give it higher marks, even though there is some aftermarket support out there, is because what I would say is the most critical area for the gun in terms of reliability, we do not have an aftermarket answer to that problem yet, and that is the magazines. Like I said, the Streebog magazines are a bit on the delicate side, and depending on the conditions under which they're used, you will see them break, and you'll see them break sooner than you would on other magazines. And unfortunately, there are no aftermarket producers of Streebog magazines that I have found. If we did have aftermarket Streebog magazines that fixed a lot of the issues, had stronger feed lips, had reinforced polymer siding, didn't have some of the problems with breakages along the spine and whatnot, etc., then that would get me a lot happier. But the area in which it is most needed, there is not aftermarket support there yet. We do not have aftermarket magazines for the Streebog yet. If either Grand Power themselves, because that's the company that makes the Streebog, if Grand Power themselves came up with just simply a better magazine, that would really go a long way to solving a lot of problems there. But if someone in the aftermarket would step up and fix the problem as well, that would be fantastic, and I would love that. But For all the aftermarket goodies that are out there, and they do have different charging handles, and like I said, you can get the extended bolt releases and things like that. There's a number of different brace options that are available. There is a lot of aftermarket stuff, but the reason why I'm scoring it so low is because the area that is needed most, which is the magazine, is the area that they've been basically silent on. All the aftermarket producers are like, we're not touching that. So disappointment there. And then the AKV, I rate it similar to the Sub 2000. Some people would put it higher. But I rate it similar to the Sub 2000, and that there is a lot of aftermarket support for it, in the sense that a lot of the components are interchangeable with things that are already out there. So the particular version of the AKV that I have is the one with the triangle side folding brace, and that brace mounts to a pick rail, and there are tons of other braces that you can mount to pick rails as well. That's a pretty adaptable system, so you can put a lot of braces on there if you want to. And then the furniture that it uses is basically standard AK furniture, and so if I wanted to get a different pistol grip, I can take a pistol grip off of another AK and swap it on there, and it'll be just fine. And same thing with the lower handguard and the upper handguard, basically. I can swap those out pretty easily as well. And then the compensator that's on the front of the muzzle seems like it attaches in a fairly standard way to a lot of other devices that are out there, so it seems like there would be at least some interchangeability there. And then the magazines that they use, they have their own proprietary magazine. Well, how you define proprietary might come into that. But the PSA makes their own magazine, the U9 magazine, but it's usually interchangeable with the CZ Scorpion magazine. And in fact, my AKV actually is able to run the brass case ammunition that I was complaining about before with the 20-round windowed CZ magazines. Not the factory ones that came from PSA, but the factory magazines from CZ it does just fine with, which is weird. But still, pretty decent aftermarket support. It hasn't been on the market as long as the CZ Scorpion, so there's not a lot of stuff that is as specific to the AKV as the CZ Scorpion. But for most of the things that you're going to need, like getting a different brace, getting different handles, getting different furniture, getting different magazines, all that stuff is there. And like I said, the factory CZ magazines seem to work better than the PSA magazines do. And so that kind of solves the reliability problem. I wish that it was PSA that solved the reliability issue, but ironically another company did, in this particular case at least. Sample size of 1, okay, I understand that. But in my particular case, it runs better on CZ stuff than it does on PSA stuff. Alright, then last but not least, features. In terms of features, like I mentioned before, I'm looking at, mounting for being able to attach different stuff to the gun. I'm looking at how easy it is to mount slings to the gun. Does it have sling points of any kind? And then also looking at things like the open sights that it comes with. What are what's the quality there? And then last but certainly not least, the last round bolt hold open. On the CZ Scorpion carbine, it has basically all those features in spades. It's a big long gun, but the advantage of a big long gun is that you got plenty of space to mount stuff. And the fore end is basically a bunch of M-LOK slots, so you have lots of M-LOK options that you can attach there. So mounting is not a problem. As far as slings are concerned, the stock does have a sling point on it, and then on the main receiver there are a couple of sling points as well. They're not super conventional sling points, and that is a point of contention that I have with CZ on that one. I wish they'd done something that was a little bit more conventional, like proper QD mounts and things like that. But they are at least functional, and you can get a lot of things to run with them. And so on the CZ Scorpion carbine, you have a total of 6 positions that you can put a sling mount on one way or another. So it's good that way. The open sights on CZs are excellent as far as I'm concerned. Now, on some of the CZs, they've started to just doing the Madpole pop-up sights, which I personally don't like for the particular gun. But they do work, and they are functional, and they are very accurate, so they're not bad. But I like the traditional old style ones. Yes, they're a little bit heavier because they're basically solid metal and those kinds of things, but I really do like the standard open sights that CZ at least used to be putting on their Scorpions. They are very precisely adjustable, and they are excellently functional. They're an aperture and post type sight, and they're an aperture post type sight that I personally feel is better than even, say, the H&K option. The H&K aperture sight that they use on the MP5 is a decent aperture sight, but one of the problems that I have with it is that that particular aperture sight really limits your field of view around the target. You know, you open up you turn it to the biggest hole, and that gives you a lot more space around the target. But the nice thing about the CZ Scorpion's aperture system is that it doesn't block out everything else. Instead, it's basically a set of rings that you just rotate through, and until you find the one that you want. And there can be a little bit of blockage with the smaller aperture sizes, but it does not really limit your peripheral view. Not that it'd be really peripheral, but it doesn't limit your view out of the sides of your target nearly as much as even the HK aperture sights do. So for what they are, for open sights, the CZ Scorpion carbine open sights are great. And then, of course, both the CZ Scorpion carbine and the CZ Scorpion pistol, of course, have last round bolt hold open, and the lever that is used to activate that last round bolt hold open, or I should say deactivate it, is very functional, very usable, excellent system. I love it. I've talked about it in previous videos, but I really do like the bolt release that they have. It's excellent. The reason why I'm giving the CZ Scorpion pistol a demotion in terms of features is just for the simple fact that the forend is smaller, and therefore you can't attach as much stuff to it. You just don't have as much rail space. That's the only thing that I'd really say against it, though. And then also, with it being a pistol, a lot of times, depending on what you're going to do legally, you can be stuck with braces, and braces usually do not have quite as many options as true stocks do, so there's a little bit of limitation there as well. So not quite as full of a feature. Right, sub 2000 when it comes to features. You know, for mounting options, it's not terrible. It doesn't have maybe as much space as the CZ Scorpion carbine does, but kind of not really. The forend on it has pick rail above and below, and on the sides has M-LOK slots, and so you actually do have quite a bit of usable space there. Now, functionally, just because that forend is so small, you might not be able to get as much on it as you could on the CZ Scorpion carbine, but there are still lots of attachment points there, so mounting is not a huge issue. As far as slings are concerned, that is a bit of an issue because there's basically only one sling point on the gun, and that is on the stock. And that's not an absolutely awful place to have a sling point if you're only going to have one place to attach a sling, but I would really, really prefer that they have two. So there's a little bit of limitation there. Little, but not great. And then the open sights that they have on the sub 2000 are fully adjustable, which is good, but they also sit kind of low in the stock configuration. It doesn't, like I said, it doesn't look like they're low, but when you actually go to put a cheek well on it, they actually are pretty low and fairly inconvenient in that regard. And so, are the open sights that they come with adjustable and functional? Yes, but they are really much more comfortable if you raise them a little bit, and so they're not nearly as functional as they could be. But the thing that kills it in terms of features, the reason why I gave it a 4, is because it doesn't have last round bolt open. And for safety practical concerns with a gun like this, where you have a really awkward heavy charging handle, a last round bolt hold open for both the safety perspective and then just for functional, being able to run the gun quickly, change magazines quickly, that kind of thing. Last round bolt hold open really would be a great thing. And yeah, and I'm not the only one who's complained about that. And we also understand that there is a cost equation going on here. It is easily the cheapest of the bunch here. And so you save a lot of money on the initial investment, but you do give up the last round bolt hold open, and that I consider to be a pretty significant loss. Maybe a deal breaker for some people, maybe not for others, But for me, that is pretty much one of the most important features that a gun can have, and it doesn't have it, so 4 out of 10. The Streebog, in terms of features, does get a lot of things right. For example, it does have last round bolt hole open, so I'm not going to put it in the bottom half of the 10 scale. I'm going to put it in the top half for that. So it does have last round bolt hole open. That is good. And as far as mounting places, it's kind of a short gun, so you don't have as many mounting places, but it's still not terrible. I mean, it does have a pick rail on the bottom, it does have a pick rail on the top, and it does have some M-LOK slots on the sides. The problem, though, is that the rear M-LOK slots are somewhat taken up by the barrel assembly, and so you can't really make full use of the rear M-LOK slots, but they're still pretty functional. They're still good. So in terms of mounting options, not terrible. Last round bolt hold open is good, but where it really is kind of a fail is when it comes to slings and the open sights that it comes with. As far as sling mounts, there are no sling mounts. The Stribog Sp9a1 does not come with any sling mounts built into the gun, and that is really super annoying, and I hate it. I like it when my guns have at least a sling point, if not multiple. The CZ Scorpion has 4 sling points, 2 forward and 2 aft. The CZ Scorpion Carbine has 6 sling points, 2 forward, 2 middle, and 2 aft. The Sub 2000 has sling points at least on the stock, but the Streebog has absolutely none. At least none that I saw when I had it. It is rather destitute of sling optionness, and I do not like that at all. So no slingies for you. And then on top of that, the open sights that it comes with are very chintzy. They're little pieces of plastic that you pop up. They are not adjustable at all, and depending on how you're using them, not overly functional. So they are there, but not really, and I get where they're going. Like I mentioned at the outset of this, when I'm thinking about these guns, I'm thinking about them with a red dot, and that's how most people think about them. You know, some kind of holographic sight, red dot, something is the way that most people are running their guns now. The days of open sights for a lot of people with a lot of guns are kind of dead and dying. I still like it when companies go the extra mile to produce good open sights of their own, like CZ did with the older style, low profile sights for the Scorpions. I love those. Or at least make sure that they have some kind of functional sights like the Sub 2000 has. But when they basically just kind of phone it in and say, well, here's a little piece of plastic you can pop up if you get in a desperate situation, that's not overly reassuring. It meets the bare minimum definition of functional, but that is about it. And like I said, I get it. They're intending for people to put some kind of an optic on it. I understand that. But to me, it shows pride and concern for your work, especially in the realm of stud guns, when you include good open sights. Streebog doesn't do that. Is that something necessarily to ding them for? It depends on who you are. Personally, I like open sights, so I'm going to ding them for it. But I know a lot of people that would say, I'm glad that they made the change and stopped worrying about things that they don't need to. It depends on your perspective. And then features, the AKV, I would say, is better than the Streebog, in that it does not only have open sights, but they're actually adjustable. They're not finely adjustable, and I don't think that they're very easy to acquire at speed, but they are fairly precise in terms of, once you get them on target, you have a pretty good idea of what the hold is, and they are truly adjustable. They're not as finely adjustable as the CZ Scorpion stock open sights are, but they are adjustable, so I'll give them that. And then as far as sling mounting options are concerned, I really do not like the AKV. It does have a sling mounting point, whereas the Streebog does not, so I'll give it credit for that, but it is not a functional sling mounting point as far as I'm concerned. It is on the left-hand side of the fore end of the gun, and that is like the worst place to put a single sling point. Now, on the versions of it that have the SPA3 brace on it. I think the SPA3 does have a sling mount, and so you can use the both in tandem, and that works real well. But on this version, it has the triangle folding brace. A single sling mount up at the front is pretty much useless, because that means that your gun is going to be dangling muzzle up, you know, and that's not good. Dangling muzzle up, usually, you know, below your shoulders, is not a great idea. So it is technically there, but it is just about as close to non-functional as you can get. Like I said, in the versions that have the fixed brace, the SPA3 brace, it works out okay because the SPA3 has a sling mount point, and so you can use the two in tandem. But in this version that you have pictured here with the triangle folding brace, not so much. But on the plus side, it does have a last round bolt hold open, and a very functional one, a very good one. It has a fairly small button that is out of the way when you need it to be, but easy to activate for when you do. So last round bolt hold open is good. As far as attaching stuff to it, mounting options, you're pretty limited with the AKV. At least as it comes in this configuration that's pictured here. Now you can swap out that furniture for, say, some of the Magpul stuff, and some of the Magpul stuff does have some mounting options in it. They'll have M-LOK slots and stuff like that. So you can get a little bit of mounting options, but in the stock configuration as it is now, it's basically just that upper rail, and that upper rail is, of course, attached to the desk cover, and the desk cover is on a hinge, and so you're going to lose 0. It might not be by a whole lot, but you do lose 0. And so technically has some mounting options, technically has open sights that are adjustable, has a really good last round bolt hold open, just about as non-functional of a sling mount as you could possibly have in this configuration. So in terms of features, I'm going to give it a 7. Okay, especially for having decent open sights as compared to the Streebog, I'm going to give it a 7. So where does that leave us in total? In total, it gives us the CC Scorpion Carbine having the best total. Now, these are not weighted in any way for different people. They're going to emphasize different things. A lot of people might be really interested in having a lightweight gun. And if you're interested in having a lightweight gun, obviously the CC Scorpion Carbine is probably not going to be the best pick for you. But if you consider all of the categories the same, then the CZ Scorpion Carbine winds up being the top of the pack, followed closely by the CZ Scorpion Pistol. And then after that, you have the Stribog Sp9a1. After that is the AKV, and the reason why the AKV would be so low is primarily would have to do with the reliability issue that I had. So this ranking is reflecting my experience. Other people who got AKVs that function correctly are obviously not going to feel that way about it, and so they would probably rank it higher. And then last, but certainly not least, at 59 total points, the Sub 2000 Gen 2 9mm. And for the cost, the Sub 2000 really is the most bang for your buck. But the problem is that in going for something that is that low, you do lose a lot of other features and market support and all those other kinds of things compared to a lot of the other guns. There is definitely a trade-off. Less expensive guns just don't simply have as nice of features, don't have a good as trigger a lot of times, ergos are off, etc., etc. So there is a trade-off there, but if you're interested in the money, saving money that is, the Sub 2000 is not a terrible way to go. And in the grand scheme of things, it's not that far off from some of the other guns here. I mean, our maximum spread is only 12 points, from 59 up to 71. Out of a total possible of 90. That is not terrible. I wouldn't say that any of these guns are necessarily inherently terrible. Going back to the AKV for a second with its reliability issue, I would say yes, make sure you test your gun with whatever ammo you plan on using first, and if you plan on using the gun for a serious application like self-defense or something like that, test it very rigorously first. But aside from that being said, none of these guns are absolutely terrible as PC3s, as pistol caliber guns with a third point of contact. You know, I wouldn't say that any of these are necessarily the best PC3s out there, but I wouldn't say that any of these are the absolute worst either. These are, I would say, you know, fair to middling. You know, they're decent enough. And certainly with a little bit of aftermarket guru-ness, you could definitely make some of them a little bit better. Some of them come stock pretty good anyways. But yeah, all in all, I actually do like all of these guns in one respect or another. They might not be the gun for me, and might not be what I like personally, but as guns that you can find a niche in the market for, I think all of them do have their little niche in the market, and fulfill that particular niche quite well. The Sub 2000 is obviously targeted toward those people who want very small, compact guns. It does that quite well. For people who want guns that are perhaps more robust, more military-esque, and fairly reliable, the CZ Scorpion Carbine and CZ Scorpion Pistol are very hard to beat, especially right out of the box. Not overly ergonomic, but very reliable out of the box. The Stribog Sp9a1 is also pretty reliable out of the box, given the caution about the magazine stuff that I talked about, but still fairly reliable out of the box, and a little bit less expensive. Not all bad. The AKV, you know, for a recreational gun, yeah, fun. And a lot of people who want AK pattern guns, but don't necessarily want to pay the AK prices for ammo, although AK ammo is usually not super expensive, but it is usually a little bit more expensive than 9mm is. Want something that's a little bit cheaper to shoot, you know, more recreational oriented, or maybe even competition oriented if it'll run good with your competition ammo. All those kinds of things, you know, go for it. I don't see a problem with any of these guns. I think they all have their place, they all have their niche, and depending on the person, it could work out really well for them. Me, I don't like overly heavy guns unless it gains me something, so I'm not a big fan of the AKV or even the CZ Scorpion Carbine for that matter. I'm going to be much more drawn to the Stribog, the Sub 2000, and the CZ Scorpion. I'm also a big fan of things that are reliable out of the box, so the CZ Scorpion, Sub 2000, Streebog are definitely going to be on the preference there, and it's things that I don't have to worry about for a while, don't have to worry about replacing parts or magazines for a bit. That kind of excludes the Streebog on that regard. And then things that are also fairly pleasant to shoot, kind of gets rid of the Sub 2000, so for me, the CZ Scorpion pistol is kind of where it's at. But those are my needs and my desires. Different people are going to be different, and they're going to weight these things differently. And I'm totally okay with that. Just be wise about how you're doing it, be realistic about how you're doing it, and frankly, there is no such thing as a perfect gun. There's just better and worse choices for you. And hopefully this little diatribe has given you some things to consider about what would be better or worse from you. Okay, and the way that this chart came out, it should be fairly obvious that I like the CZ Scorpion. There's a bias there on my part, but hopefully I gave you information on the others that will allow you to make fair choices about them as well. All right, that's it, finally. Thank you all for your time and attention, especially if you stuck through all of that. Try to have a good one out there, guys. Bye.